Hi, everybody. This is the lecture on elections and voting overview. I hope you are doing well. We're going to cover the purposes of elections. What are elections exactly? How do they function? And ultimately, as I've mentioned to you before, it's really the linchpin of a democracy. We have elections to ultimately allow us to choose our representatives as well as the policies we're going to live by. And to average citizens, it may seem like a very complex process because it also determines, which part of the electorate will be heard, and really the general public, because for those citizens who are eligible to vote but who don't turn out to vote, ultimately their voice are not heard. And so today we're going to learn more in depth about the intricacies of the election. We're going to focus on the election process again, more specifically. And hopefully by the end of this lecture, you'll uncover a stunning irony here that even though Americans have many more opportunities to get their voice heard through voting, and how voting has expanded in recent decades, what's interesting is that less and less Americans are actually participating. So we're going to also try to tackle that question, why people don't vote. So that being said, let's go ahead and get started. So what are the purpose of elections? This is a slide that should be a review for all of you. Hopefully by now you understand that we both have both direct and indirect democracy. So let's just go ahead and review what that means. Remember, we under an indirect democracy, we have a representative system of government where we, the people, choose representatives who will make policies on our behalf. And we also have, of course, direct democracy, where we, the people, make and vote for the policies ourselves, at least here in California, as well as roughly half of the states in the Union. They involve, of course, popular consent, and is based as well on majority rule. This is where ultimately we can express our consent, so we can give authority and legitimacy to the rules that we're going to live by, as I mentioned, as well as the representatives who make policies on our behalf. And ultimately, we'll revisit here the criteria to free and fair elections with much more depth that will give, again, these representatives as well as the rules legitimacy. So here again are the criteria to free and fair elections, which we discussed when we first met, when we did that mock general election. And I made the point in that exercise to explain to you that elections can only be free and fair when they're considered legitimate. And the only way that they're going to be deemed legitimate is if these criteria were to be met. And again, there were 4 broad requirements that I outlined for you that we'll go through in much more greater depth in each slide. And so let's go ahead and revisit them. First, elections must be held regularly. People need to know when elections take place. They must be open to participation. Everyone who is meets the requirement to vote are able to vote. Elections must be competitive, meaning that there should be more than one candidate running for a particular office, that they be challenged. And last but not least, the process of elections must be transparent, must be verifiable. That assures that the votes are being counted accurately, without a doubt. And so these are the four that we'll look at, and again here revisit, and talk about more of the expectations of how we ultimately meet these 4 points. So let's take a look at the first one. Elections must be held regularly, and as I mentioned in our exercise in the beginning of the semester, I told you here in the United States we meet this criteria. We hold elections every 2 years, every even-numbered year. We also know when Election Day is. At least for the general election, it lands on a Tuesday, the first Tuesday of the month of November. That being said, what are our expectations here? What are the theoretical expectations that have to be met in order to meet this criteria? Well, hint, hint, first and foremost, we must reconsent to be governed by those individuals and by these rules. That is a hallmark of a democracy. Public opinion changes over time. And in fact, that's my second point. Since we have differing opinions of our leaders, we may think of them favorably after we elect them in office, and maybe some of us may not think so favorably of them after they serve their term. It gives us an opportunity to reevaluate what they've done, and whether or not they deserve our vote, and deserve to be reelected into that office. And so that gives us the opportunity, elections gives us the opportunity to reconsent, to not just, of course, our elected officials, but the policies that we pass, or at least in an indirect democracy that they pass as well. Moving forward, we also expect high turnout, generally speaking. We also expect that the voting public represents the general public. Okay, in order for elections to be legitimate, we want to make sure that people turn out to vote. Because if people don't, and let's just say, for example, that only 15% of eligible voters turned out to vote, then clearly the representatives who are elected are only represented by a smaller group of folks, a smaller minority, a minority of the electorate. And so, in the eyes of everyone, you could argue the election itself is not a reflection of the will of the general public. Okay, and again, that ties into that second point. Now, elections must also fulfill this criteria of open participation, and I mentioned this to you. Our expectation here is universal suffrage. This idea that everyone can vote, and really, if you think about this process, the more people that are allowed to vote, the better, because you'll have a better representation of the people and their wants and their desires and their demands. And so open to participation means that there should be, again, this idea of universal suffrage. Okay, suffrage has nothing to do with suffering in this context. It's about voting, right? Universal suffrage, which is a Latin term, used to refer to a table, a stone table where the ancient Greeks and would cast their votes, and that term has evolved over time and has stuck, in fact, with us. And so, suffrage means to vote. Everyone can vote. We also expect accessibility to voting and polling places. This is important and falls under the criteria to open participation. It may seem very simple, a simple point that we should be able to access voting places. But again, if people are deprived of being able to access to their voting place, that is a violation of their voting rights, and they are unable to participate. So a good example of this would be the ADA, right? The American Disabilities Act, that allows people who have mobility issues to provide them ways to access their polling place. That's why most polling places occur in public buildings such as schools and city halls, where they are ADA compliant, right? No one is turned away. In our history, unfortunately, in particular in southern states, there were shenanigans and instances where racist policies would mention the polling place to be in one location, and the last minute it would be changed to a different location to prevent really minority voters from participating, particularly African American voters. And here's another a good example of that from a foreign policy standpoint. This is the reason why when we go to places like Afghanistan and Iraq and rebuild their regimes and build up democracies, that it's important to set up democracies by ensuring that elections are free and fair. If you want to undermine our mission in those countries to build democracies, all the terrorists have to do is to prevent or try to persuade voters to not vote on election day. And of course, other means, including violence, have been used to try to threaten and scare people from voting. A good example using open to participation here is to have terrorists find a willing suicide bomber to strap on a bomb and blow him or herself up as they stand in line for on election day in order to vote. And again, if that happens, then people don't turn out to vote. And if people don't turn out to vote, as I explained in the previous slide, then the government that is elected will not be seen as legitimate in the eyes of the people if only, for example, say 10 to 15% of the electorate actually voted for them. So this point about accessibility may be simple, and it is, but its ramifications and its consequences, when it is undermined, can undermine the entire election process, as well as the government that would be legitimized from it. The third bullet point, you have the right to leave to work in order to vote. Your employer should allow you to exercise your civic duty to do that, whether or not you come to work a little bit late in the morning or leave a little bit early in the afternoon or have an extended lunch period. You should be able to exercise your right to vote. We have a right to an absentee ballot. In fact, what is an absentee ballot? You have the right to vote by mail. And this began with the military, in fact, when our military men and women serving overseas were prevented from voting. And it's quite ironic in that here they are defending our nation, and they are being their civic right, which they're defending, and deprive them to vote. And so the government created absentee ballots to allow them to vote by mail, so their voice could also be heard. And this has greatly expanded not just to the military, but you and me. And I would encourage all of you, if you meet the qualifications, of course, to vote, to sign up for the absentee. It'll make it much more convenient for you, so you don't have to go to your polling place, and all you do is vote by mail, and place your ballot in an envelope, put a stamp on it, and send it off. And lastly, the last expectation here is the right to information. We do have the right to information when it comes to elections, but what we don't have is the right to accurate information. And in an age of alternative facts, in an age where there is a lot of media bias, getting down to the nitty-gritty and understanding, what is fact from fiction, what is hyperbole and exaggeration is ever so difficult. And we will revisit this when we look at the media. And so it is important that we, as a educated civic and educated citizenry who's civically minded, are able to parse through the bias and understand that, so we can get down to really understanding the what we're voting for and the policies that we're voting for. So we do have that right to information, but it's important that we understand what we are voting for. So let's talk about the third criteria to free and fair elections, and that is competitiveness. And so we expect competitive elections, and so how do we go about doing that? It's not up on the PowerPoint, but let's just say there was only one candidate who's running for a particular office. How then does that meet competitiveness if competitiveness requires at least one challenger challenging the incumbent, right? The person who currently has office. Well, when this happens, and this happens more occasionally at the local level, then you have on your ballot a blank line that is the write-in. And so that blank line satisfies the competitiveness of elections. So FYI, something for you to understand about elections if we have one candidate. So what other factors affect the competitiveness of elections? Clearly there are formal qualifications as stipulated in the Constitution. We went over this. There's qualifications to run for the U.S. House of Representatives, the U.S. Senate, definitely qualifications to run for the presidency. And so there are formal qualifications. But what are some of the informal qualifications? What are some of the factors that will help you win elections that are not necessarily required? And as you can see, I have a laundry list of perhaps X factors that will enable you to win elections. This is not a complete list, an exhaustive list. I'm sure there's more, but I believe these are the most important. First and foremost, experience and background. Right? In order to run for political office, it usually helps to have some political experience, some public service. And it allows you to separate yourselves from other candidates who may not have public experience. Name recognition, popularity, clearly this is going to help you. Do people know who you are? Is so important. And in fact, that makes me think about an important saying about politics, which I think most people get incorrect when people say it's about who you know. Really, it's not about who you know. Anyone can know anyone. It's about if people know who you are. That's where the true power comes from. And typically, candidates who have name recognition, such as our current president, Donald Trump, even though he doesn't have public service experience and background, we know that his name is a brand. We know he is a reality TV show host, and so people know him because he's popular. Another important criteria to run for a political office that's not a requirement but definitely helps you is access to money, whether if it's your own personal wealth or the ability for you to know wealthy friends and have access to their money to help you win political office. Character, personality is so important. Are you charismatic? And typically, candidates are. They have that appeal to voters. Let me give you an example. Some of you may know of the very first presidential debate. That debate was between Richard Nixon and JFK. And before the debate, the makeup artist asked both candidates if they wanted makeup. And so JFK, I guess who was more politically savvy about using the media at the time, told the makeup artist, "Go ahead, lay it on me." And Richard Nixon said, no real man wears makeup. Well, those who watched the debates on television clearly saw JFK to have won. Those who listened to it on the radio, and again, polls were conducted regarding this, and those who listened to it in the radio found Nixon won, given that he gave more substantive answers than did JFK. But it shows you the impact of television. And if you've ever seen the debate, and I would highly recommend, not a requirement, but highly recommend you find clips of it on YouTube, but JFK just looked good. He looked very presidential. In fact, women were swooning over him. And if you looked at Richard Nixon, he looked like he was suffering from dengue fever or Ebola. It wasn't pleasant. He had drips of his sweat running down his nose, running down his cheeks. Just wasn't a favorable, his countenance was not appealing to most voters. And that's why JFK won those who watched it on television. So that should say something about our politics, right? Does this mean that in order for you to win political office, you have to look good? And if I were in class, we would have a little bit of a discussion about that question, because if we do agree that looking good is an important criteria, then what does that say about us? And so I would just argue that character and personality and charisma, yes, they do help, but hopefully voters evaluate candidates more holistically than that they consider different factors. For example, their experience, their background, their intellect, their education, okay, which I don't have here, but that would be another informal qualification. Clearly, endorsements from political parties, as well as interest groups, particularly influential interest groups, are going to make a difference. And again, that's going to depend, of course, ideologically and as to where those interest groups lie. So more on that when we get to interest groups later on in this unit. And as I said, political party affiliation. I would say that in order to win any seat, at least the major seats in the federal government, you have to be either a Republican or Democrat. Very, very difficult to win as an independent or as a third-party candidate. So those are the formal criteria. Informal criteria, qualifications to run for political office. And so lastly, we're going to talk about verifiable results, which is again the last criteria to free and fair elections. So what are our expectations here? We expect that our votes are going to be counted accurately, and that they're going to be tabulated accurately, that will ultimately produce a legitimate winner. And so that requires a transparent process, right? That requires that the general public should be able to look at and observe how the votes are being counted, which, by the way, is permissible in our system. You can go to the county registrar's office and sit there and watch them count the ballots. It'll be boring, but you are entitled as a citizen to examine the process and make sure that it is a transparent process and that your ballots are being counted accurately. So who counts the ballots? Well, these independent officials do. Now, I know what you may be thinking. Wait a second, Professor V, how can we really trust these independent officials? Well, they can be trusted because there are checks and balances in the process. The ballots are typically counted by a group of people, and other groups of folks, in fact, surround these groups of people who are counting, and they are observing the process. And if it was a recount, then they would count it multiple times. Several years ago, we had Mike Coleman, who was the incumbent senator from Minnesota, was challenged by Al Franken, and that close was razor thin. And so there were, I believe, 7 million ballots that were cast in that election, and it was so close that they had to recount every single ballot by hand, and it took them 6 months to do. And at the end of the day, I believe the vote, the margin was a few hundred votes that separated the two candidates. So you can, in a way, trust in the process that the ballots are being counted accurately. Ballots are supposed to be secret because you don't want others to you don't want to bias others in how you voted, and you don't want to be the victim of retribution in how you voted, as was in the past. If people know how you voted, you could be targeted. And so even though our ballots are secret, I will tell you, even though it's not necessarily falls under this topic per se, our donations, our campaign donations, are not secret. Our votes are, but our campaign donations are not. So we'll talk much more about that in campaigns and elections, but there's some major ramifications to that. Given that, I'll just speak to it briefly here. If you donate more than $100 to a particular campaign, your donation will appear publicly in the Secretary of State's website office. And so people can find out which candidate or which issue that you supported. And we have had some instances here where this list has been used for political purposes to target certain individuals. And this was the case during the campaign, the Proposition 8 campaign that would amend the Constitution to recognize between a man and a woman, and the No on 8 campaign that was supported by the LGBTQ community. And it got very messy, and it got very personal. And so think about that for a moment, how our votes, again, are supposed to be secret, but our campaign donations are not. And, it's pretty easy to conclude that if you donate to a campaign, that you would vote and support that particular candidate or issue. So let's talk briefly about election intervals. This is actually quite straightforward. We have elections in our country every 2 years, every even-numbered year. As I mentioned to you, we have a general election, and we know that happens on the first Tuesday of November of every even-numbered year. Everyone has set terms of office except for federal judges. House members serve for 2-year terms, senators 6-year terms, the president 4-year terms, Supreme Court justices for life. And so understand that federal judges do not have, again, these set terms because they're not elected. They're appointed by the president, confirmed by the U.S. Senate. But everyone else is directly elected by the people, or in the case of the president, elected by the Electoral College. Now, under the general election cycles, okay, these are, hint, hint, the elections that occur every 4 years. We have a presidential election cycle, and then we have a midterm election cycle. So we just had, in 2016, a presidential election where we voted for the President of the United States and the Vice Presidential candidate, those tickets. Everyone else is elected also at that time. Your House member, your senator, if they are facing re-election. By the way, senators are staggered, right? A third of the Senate faces re-election every 2 years, and that allows for continuity and experience to remain in that body. So that's the reason why senators do not face re-election, all of them at the same year. They are staggered in office. At the state level, you would vote for your assembly member, maybe your state senator, again, if they're up for re-election. At the county level, you have the Board of Supervisors. At the city level, you have city council or even a mayor. And then you have all of these propositions that you have to vote for, as well as other local offices. So as you can see, your ballot can get pretty long. And so that's the presidential election cycle. It occurs every 4 years. Our last one, as I said, is in 2016. Our next one will be in 2020. So midterm elections are the elections that occur in between presidential elections. So our last midterm election was 2014. Our next one will be 2018 here. And so the only thing that I want you to know is that in midterm elections, we clearly do not elect the president and the vice presidential ticket, but rather here in California, we elect the governor, as well as all other members of the plural executive. So, hint, hint, that's something unique about California and the midterm elections. So I want to talk about the types of elections that we have, and so I want to backtrack a little bit. I know we just talked about the general elections, but in order to run for political office, you actually have to win 2 elections. You have to win the primary election and then win the general election. So what's the purpose of the primary elections? The primary elections were created to whittle the number of candidates who are seeking the same office to one candidate and become that party's nominee. I want you to understand that before the advent of the primary election, where the voters elected the nominee, this was done behind closed doors. This was changed during the early part of the 20th century, during the Progressive era, and now, because of people demanding more transparency, the primaries are directly voted in by, in this case, party members. Okay, and so again, the purpose of the primary election is to whittle the number of candidates, for example, the number of candidates who are running for president to 1. And we saw in 2016 that the Republicans had a good number of candidates. The Democrats only had 3, right? And that was Martin O'Malley, Hillary Clinton, and Bernie Sanders. But at the end of the day, the primary election whittles down those candidates seeking that office to 1. And in this case, on the Republican side, clearly Donald Trump won the Republican nomination, Hillary Clinton won the Democratic nomination, and those 2 candidates would then face off in the general election. So that's how that works. And so let's talk about the different types of primary elections in California, and it's important for you to know this. Hint, hint, good matching section or multiple choice section for the exam. Let's talk about the closed primary, okay? Under a closed primary, now pay close attention here, only registered members of a particular party can vote in the primary election, okay? So for example, if I'm a registered Democrat, then the only candidates I could vote for are Democratic candidates in that primary, okay? That's a closed primary. Only registered members of a particular party can vote in that party primary election. An open primary, you guys, is the opposite to that, right? In a closed primary, as I mentioned, if I'm a registered Democrat, I can only vote for Democratic candidates. If I'm a registered Republican, I can only vote for Republican candidates. If I am a member of the Green Party, I can only vote for Green Party candidates. The open primary, on the other hand, is the opposite of that. Okay, a registered voter may vote in any party primary regardless of his or her own party affiliation. So it's open to everyone, right? It's open to all voters regardless of their party affiliation. So take, for example, I can be a Republican, and if I want to vote for the Democratic candidate in the primary, the open primary allows me to do this. I can go there and I can ask for whichever party primary ballot I want to vote for, and it doesn't matter if I belong to that party or not. Okay? Understand, guys, that the open primary was deemed unconstitutional. Okay, hint, hint. This is very important. The reason why it was deemed unconstitutional, and again, think about this, is because you can rig the election using the open primary. Now, you're probably curious, how do you do that? Well, you can vote for the least likely candidate of the party that you are trying to undermine. So, for example, if I am a Democrat and I want to undermine the Republican party primary, then I would vote for the least likely candidate who has a chance of winning. The strategy here being that this will allow the candidate who really doesn't have a good chance of winning, or the weak, let's just go ahead and say it this way, the weak candidate to be nominated. And of course, you're betting that your political party nominates their strongest candidate, and that these two candidates will ultimately meet each other in the general election, and hopefully, right, your candidate, your party's candidate, will trounce the weaker candidate. And so that, folks, was one of the reasons why it was deemed unconstitutional. And the other reason, which we'll revisit back in Unit 4, is that it violates the political party's First Amendment right to associate. Now, what do I mean by that? We'll talk much more again in greater depth about this later on, but it is this idea that people can form their own groups without any outside interference. Now, if you take a look at what the open primary does, it allows different voters who are not even affiliated with that party, right? They don't belong to that political party, to affect the leadership of that party. And the Supreme Court has said that that was unconstitutional and unfair. And so, because the open primary was deemed unconstitutional, we now have in California what's called the modified closed primary, and this only applies to presidential elections today. And so why is it modified? It's modified because it still remains a closed primary, okay? Meaning that you can only vote for the presidential candidate that you have an affiliation with in terms of the political party. But it's modified because it addresses the question of what to do with the decline to state independent voters, those who don't affiliate with any political party. Because if you think about this, if you are a decline to state, and we know decline to state voters have been increasing in California, if you decline to state your political party affiliation, you're not going to get a primary ballot, right? Because it's partisan. And since you don't affiliate with any political party, clearly you can't vote, and in this case, for the presidential election. And so the modified closed primary allows decline to state voters to participate in the primary election. Here it is. If the political parties themselves give permission or allow decline to state voters to participate in their party's primary. Okay, so let me repeat that. Under the modified closed primary, it's a closed primary in that, again, you can only vote for presidential primary candidates that you affiliate with, right, depending on the political party that you affiliate. But it addresses the question of what to do with declined to state voters. And so this has been used strategically by the political parties, you guys, because in a way this could also hurt them or help them. So for example, it really depends where the decline of state voters lean ideologically, whether or not political parties will allow them to participate or not. So back in 2008, okay, because of the pushback against George W. Bush, not a lot of people liked him. He had very low approval ratings. The independent voters and declined to state voters leaned more left. So in that instance, the Democratic Party opened their doors and said, hey, come on in. You're allowed to vote in our primary. Republicans said no. Okay, they shut the doors and said, no, you can't participate. In 2010, it was the opposite. Okay, because of the failure of, because of the passage of Obamacare, the Republicans were energized in 2010, and so the Republican Party said, hey, let's allow decline to state party voters to vote in our election. Democrats did not allow them to participate. Why? Folks, I think it's pretty obvious. The reason why political parties close the door on decline to state party voters is because it could have the effect of what I just described in the open primary. You don't want people to be rigging the election. You don't want people to be voting for the weakest candidate from your political party. So again, under a modified closed primary, okay, it is a closed primary, but it addresses the question of decline to state voters. And it really is up to the political party to determine whether or not decline to state voters gets to participate or not. Now, moving on to the next system. I know that was a mouthful. Back in 2010, we passed here in California what's called the top two candidates open primary. And ultimately, this was opposed by the political parties because what it did was that it got rid of the partisan primaries altogether. And it basically said that whoever receives the top two votes, okay, the candidates who receive the top two votes, vote getters, would then face each other in the general election. And as you can see, if you take a look at figure 2, above was the example of the partisan primary, right? You see in that graphic, the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, and the Green Party, you have a list of the candidates, and whoever wins the nomination from each party would then compete against each other in the general election. And the top two candidates open primary, right below it, as you can see, the top two candidates who receive the most votes would then face each other in the general election. This changes the dynamics of things, if you think about this, right? Under this system, you can have a Republican going against another Republican, or a Democrat going against another Democrat. Or in fact, it also makes viable third-party candidates as well, right? That they can vote for third-party candidates that they can in fact win a particular race, okay, and be one of those candidates to make it to the general election. So this was done to try to make elections more competitive, and also to, in a way, undermine the hold of the major political parties in the primaries. So there's that. Special elections, folks, are special because they are typically called by the governor, and they typically occur in odd-numbered years. Okay, that's why they're special elections. Governors can also call special elections if someone dies in office for a particular federal office, for example. That's what happened in Sacramento when Bob Matsui, the longtime member of Congress there, passes away. The governor called a special election to replace him, And interestingly enough, his wife, Doris Matsui, won that election. The recall election is also a type of special election, but in this case, the governor does not call for his own recall election. But that was in fact called by, back in 2003, Congressman Darrell Issa from San Diego. But that is, again, a type of special election. Just think of it this way. They occur mostly in odd-numbered years and not in even-numbered years. So if you want to compare partisan versus nonpartisan contests now in California, you guys, it's pretty much straightforward that the only partisan contest that remains in California is the one for the president. Okay? Everyone else, from the state legislatures to the governor to members of Congress, all of those are nonpartisan, primarily because those offices are now elected by the top two candidates open primary system, whereas the presidential election remains partisan under the modified closed primary model. So real quick, let me go through voting rights. I would say, and you would agree with me, that voting rights have expanded through the years. At the very beginning of this republic, there were only 3 qualifications. You had to be male, white, and own property. And of course, since then, we've expanded voting rights to be more inclusive. And so that started off with the 15th Amendment. And the 15th Amendment was ratified in 1870 as part of the Civil War amendments, and it says that the vote would not be abridged in terms of color, race, creed, or servitude. And it ultimately took another 95 years to see this to come to fruition because, well, as we'll discuss in civil rights, there were laws passed primarily in southern states called Jim Crow laws, where they passed policies like the poll tax, that you had to vote in order to vote. Grandfather clauses that said that your grandfather had to have voted if you were allowed to vote. And again, this was very unlikely if you were a slave, a freed slave. There were literacy tests that were given, right? That you had to pass the test in order to vote. And ironically, the test had nothing to do with voting. And so all of these policies that I've just described to you were really ways to prevent minorities, in particular African Americans, from voting, depriving them of their voting rights. And so we'll trace more of that later on in Civil Rights in Unit 4. Moving forward with the 19th Amendment, this was ratified in 1920, and the 19th Amendment, of course, gave women the right to vote. The 24th Amendment, as I mentioned to you what a poll tax is, you had to pay a tax to vote, was ratified in 1962, which ultimately outlawed this discriminatory policy. Not too long ago, you guys. The 26th Amendment lowered the voting age from 21 to 18. And this was ratified in 1971 in response to the Vietnam War. If Uncle Sam can draft young men to fight for the country at 18, they should not be deprived their right to vote. And last but not least, the National Voting Rights Act of 1965. Again, you could see President Johnson shaking hands with Martin Luther King there in the picture in this historic law that he signed that ultimately allowed for the banning of literacy tests, and much more, in fact. But for the sake of our class, that was a major role here of expanding voting rights to minorities. So for those of you who did the extra credit assignment, this is where I review a little bit of that and who votes in California. And hint, hint, you need to know this. What are the criteria for voting in California? Here are the 5, okay? You have to be a U.S. citizen. You have to be at least 18 years old. You have to be a resident of California. You cannot be in prison or parole or in probation. Cannot have committed a felony. And you have to be mentally competent. Okay, you can't be judged to be mentally incompetent. So those are the 5, and I think they're fairly reasonable. Okay, so whom do we exclude from the process? As you can see, it's not universal suffrage, right? Not everyone can vote. Those who are non-citizens can't vote. Those who are minors who are under 18 can't vote. Those who don't live in California can't vote here. Those who are committed crimes can't vote. And ultimately, the mentally insane can't vote. Okay, this is why, folks, voting rights is not really an accurate term. Voting is a privilege. Okay, why is it a privilege? Because voting can be taken away from you, and it can, in fact, be reinstated by a judge. Okay. So there are the 5. What can we conclude about turnout in California? I think it's pretty obvious that turnout is pretty good when it comes to general/presidential elections and midterm elections. Not so well in primary elections, and in special elections, it really depends on the issue at hand, right? If it was the recall, typically that is more sensational, gathers more attention, so therefore voting turnout tends to be a little higher than other special elections that let's say have ballot initiatives that talk about policy, which turns a lot of people off. That means not a lot of people vote. But if you look at the overall turnout of eligible voters, it's pretty dismal. Okay, it is pretty dismal. Even though under general elections there's a good turnout, it could be better. In general elections, they average between only, if you looked at your chart, maybe between 60 to 70% of eligible voters, and of course that doesn't encompass everyone. Why would turnout be low in the United States? There's a myriad of reasons why this is the case, right? They're busy. Election day lands on a Tuesday, the middle of the week. It's a work day. People are apathetic. People are lazy, disinterested. They're interested, but they don't like the choices, right? If it rains, people tend to not show up to vote. There's a lot of things that affect turnout. Other countries, in fact, have holidays and set aside weekends to have compulsory voting, like Australia and Brazil, where they will fine you if you don't vote. And some of you may be thinking, it's a great idea, right? Like, it's an incentive for you to vote, lest you be fined. But if you think about it, this could disadvantage the poor, right? The rich can pay the fine and not vote. The poor will ultimately be forced to vote. And typically, generally speaking here, the poor tend to be less educated, and so therefore may not know exactly what they're voting for. So clearly you have a skewed turnout here of forcing those poorer folks to vote, while the rich can have the privilege here to not vote. So as you can see, sometimes the policies themselves don't necessarily do what you want them to do. So what do voters look like in California? I'm going to spend some time talking about this in the next slide. So if you take a look at California's likely voters, and you've read this article, for those of you who did the extra credit, 7 in 10 of Californians are registered to vote, and independent registration continues to increase. Okay, and so there is in California a proclivity to register, which is good. You know, this increases, of course, turnout. These are again 2016 numbers, given that there was much interest, of course, in last year's presidential election. And independent, right? Decline to state voters continues to increase. If you take a look at decline to state voters, it's now at 23.3% compared to 20.9% in 2012. And the registration rate for California as a whole is at 72.3%. So it is really good. If you look at likely voters and unregistered adults, polls have been taken, and they definitely lean more Democratic, although they are ideologically mixed here as well, where 35% of likely voters tend to lean more liberal, 29% are moderate, 36% are conservative, and so again here, even though they register Democrat, there's some aspects of California voters that still have a conservative streak to them, and that should not be a surprise. As I mentioned to you in the California lecture back in Unit 1, how the individualistic political culture still plays an important factor of why certain California voters do lean more socially conservative than most other Republicans in the nation. They are disproportionately white, and they tend to be older, more educated, affluent, who own homes, and they are native-borns. And so if you take a look at this, are they representative of California? Not so much. Okay, if you take a look at unlikely voters, a good number of them are Latinos and Hispanics, and these are folks who are eligible to vote. I'm not talking about undocumented immigrants. And even take into account whites. Okay, 23% of whites are also unregistered to vote. And so that being said, this is important for us to understand because whoever votes creates the policies. Okay, and as you can see, this may not necessarily be as representative of California as a whole, and that's why there's a concerted effort to ensure that people are registering to vote, and not only register, but on election day to actually get them there out to vote. And so with that being said, this concludes elections and voting, and we'll pick it up with our next lecture during our next class session. So I hope you guys are doing well. We'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye.